Hey gang, I have a great conversation for you today with Kaitlyn Tiffany, who is the author of the new book, Everything I Need I Get From You, How Fangirls Created the Internet as We Know It. And I have a special request that is appropriate given the topic, as Kaitlyn and I talk about online life leads people to behave in strange ways. And one of those ways is that sometimes when people see my tweets and don't like them, they see the link in my bio to the Apple Podcast page for this show, and they leave a 1-star review. And honestly, I don't think I deserve as many 1-star reviews as I currently have. So if you want to fight back against the haters, you can go right now to Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app you use and give the show a 5-star rating and a positive review. Okay, enjoy the show. Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Kaitlyn Tiffany. Kaitlyn, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. My name's Kaitlyn. I'm a staff writer at The Atlantic. I write about internet culture.
And you are also, most importantly for the purposes of this conversation, the author of a new book entitled Everything I Need I Get From You, How Fangirls Created the Internet as We Know It. So congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
It just came out.
It's fun to, I didn't intentionally manipulate you into being the one who had to say the title, but maybe subconsciously I did because it's so long. And I feel kind of embarrassed reciting the whole thing, but yeah.
Yes, it is a mouthful. And I'll even say it again. Everything I Need I Get From You, subtitle How Fangirls Created the Internet as We Know It. I really enjoyed this book. It's one of the best books I've ever read about the internet. And yeah, it just there were so many interesting observations in it, and you really, you write about the internet as someone who is sort of a native to this strange place.
Mhm.
And so, is there a 1 or 2 line summary of the book that you would give to someone who has no idea what it's about?
Yeah, I guess. Oh, I'm so bad at elevator pitches. It's like a total slog for me to get any stories approved because I just ramble. But anyway, I think the way I was thinking of this book was that it would be sort of an explainer on how fandom became this kind of dominant language of the internet and therefore our culture and political discourse, but it would be sort of through the lens of my own experience as a One Direction fan. So it could be about these macro level things, but also about the sort of like more intimate, personal aspects of fandom, which are the ones that I think by the end of the book come off as sort of the positive, redeeming qualities of fandom that sort of justify the maybe, I don't know, amoral aspects of fandom at scale.
So, the book is sort of cultural history, social commentary on what the internet is like now, but also is about the band One Direction, which we will explain for people who don't know what that is. And I'm sure there's still some of them. And I was sort of one before I read this. I only had the vaguest idea of who One Direction was. And also there's some personal memoiristic aspects of the book as well. So it's a really interesting combination, and it's extremely readable. I really enjoyed it. So for someone who has never heard of One Direction, could you give a little background on who they were, are, will be?
Yeah. So like around this pretty much at the same time as Justin Bieber was when One Direction was getting started. So like the early 2010s. And they started as 5 individual auditioners on the British show The X Factor, and they were kind of like smushed into a super group of like, at the time sort of like dorky looking teens. Simon Cowell, love him or hate him, he certainly got the eye. He's the one who decided they should all kind of work as one thing because not one of them was individually interesting enough. And then from there, I think what was interesting about them or novel about them was that their early success really depended, or at least seemed to depend, on like social media support and girls who just really dedicated themselves, mostly girls, who dedicated themselves to promoting them and like making them the biggest band in the world or whatever. So I kind of position them as like the internet's first boy band, like a creation of the internet, even though they're in this like tradition of boy bands that goes back for a long time. They were a departure in that they were a lot more chaotic, accessible. They were always like tweeting embarrassing photos of each other. They just had this real like proximity to their fandom that made the fandom be really engaged in ways that were super interesting and creative and fruitful and sometimes scary.
Right. And so a reader who's interested in this book does not need to know anything about One Direction because you explain plenty, and you don't need to have an interest in, early aughts pop music either. Because that's where I was coming from. And so I was trying to remember like what I knew about One Direction before this, and I sort of remembered that their stuff would trend on Twitter in sort of the pre-Trump era, like 2015, before like a more
Yeah.
innocent period on Twitter. And I remember like I sort of knew there was a guy named Harry Styles, and that just from like seeing the trending topics. Then there was a guy who I thought his name was Zion, but actually his name is Zayn. Because it's spelled like Zayn. And that was about all I knew. And so I really don't pay that much attention to like contemporary pop music at all. And sort of, boy band that seemed to me aimed at like the audience was teenage girls. I would have no interest in this, but like the online fandom was such that they would make their presence known by sort of, taking advantage of the way various like social media networks were set up.
Mm-hmm.
When did you first encounter One Direction, and what got you interested in them?
So I talk about it a bit in the book, but I was in college when I became a One Direction fan. It was my freshman year of college. I was like very poorly suited to the college environment. I went to a super tiny high school, and then a really, really big college with like a pretty extreme like Greek life social scene, which didn't make sense for me at all. And I just kind of felt like a loser all the time. I was just like really bored. And that was really the first time in my life that I spent a lot of time on the internet. Before that, I had a pretty like all-American childhood of just like working at the mall and like playing sports. And I was not an internet kid at all. So partly it was because I was just on Tumblr all the time for the first time ever. And it was one of those subcultures that like once you stumble across it, it was just the energy seemed so like infectious that I was really intrigued by it. And I guess I'm telling things out of order kind of. The real first time I was exposed to One Direction was when I was home for the summer and went to see the documentary about them with my little sisters, just kind of being like, yeah, whatever, like I'll go along. I love movie theater popcorn and air conditioning, so who cares? And at first I was like, I cannot tell these boys apart. Like they are so generic. And by the end, it's not like I was like, oh my God, I love One Direction now, but I was definitely intrigued by them. And I also described in the book, there's like a scene in that movie where they're all like sitting around a campfire. It's actually kind of haunting now because they're talking about how they're always going to be friends whenever, if and when what's happening to them ends, like they'll be in each other's lives forever. And that's like clearly not been the case.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of sad to watch now. But in that segment, they're talking about like, what do I want basically like my legacy to be? And one of them says like, oh, I hope that a mom just tells her daughter about, the band that was cool when she was young and how terrible they were at dancing or whatever. And I just found that really moving at that time. I think just because I was like going through a rough transitional period of like trying to grow up. And so the like nostalgia of that was probably appealing to me. I'm also was like horrible at interacting with boys. I was like really craving of approval from men that I was not receiving. So I think I was also just kind of like, wow, that boy like really cares about women in the abstract. How beautiful. Even though like I did not become a Louis Tomlinson, Tomlinson is the one who said it. I did not become a Louis girl. But yeah, I don't know. There was something about them that really just like grabbed me at that moment. And then, and as I said later, like Tumblr is, I think I've described it before as like an identity accelerant. I feel like you go on Tumblr, there's so many different things you can come across, and it's so easy. Like if something grabs your attention to just like completely immerse yourself in it.
Mhm.
So as soon as I was even a little bit interested in One Direction, I could go on Tumblr and just get like so excited by how excited everyone else was. And there was just this like wealth of creativity and like in jokes around them that really helped me deal with my boredom at that time. And also because my younger sisters were into One Direction and because one of my friends from high school was into One Direction, it became something that I could talk to them about that was like fun and interesting rather than just, you know, saying over and over, oh my God, I hate my life. I hate school, blah, 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 you know?
Uh-huh. Okay, so I was never on Tumblr, and I only sort of became aware of them through like Twitter stuff. But that was, yeah, but Tumblr was really where the action was when it came to One Direction fandom
Yeah.
and
And
sort of
everything.
and other fandoms in general, and you know, younger teenagers and post teenagers in the early odds. So what was it about Tumblr during that period that like made it the place where fandoms like came together and did their thing?
I think Tumblr had some pretty key like structural features for fandom, and then it was also kind of an accident of timing. I talk about this in the book, but there had been some prominent like fan fiction platforms that had just introduced new content guidelines that banned popular categories of fanfic, including like real person. I mean, especially including real person fan fiction. So basically anything you would be writing about a celebrity. So there was a lot of fans who were already looking for a new home on the internet. And then when Tumblr emerged, it was a great place for them because at the time it was pretty novel that it offered so many different kinds of, and it still is kind of a differentiator, that it offers so many different post formats that people could do long text posts, and they could also, you know, do GIF sets, which are a like key aesthetic category of the internet that was invented on Tumblr. Like GIF sets were not a mainstream form of communication
Mhm.
before Tumblr, which is I think people tend
Well,
to
what's
forget
the
about.
difference between a GIF and a GIF set?
So like a GIF set would be like a series of GIFs like arranged in some kind of meaningful way to like show a sequence of events
Hmm.
or like a pattern or something. So like on Twitter, you can't really do, you couldn't do that until like a couple of years ago, and you couldn't even upload GIFs were limited to like a super small file size on Twitter even until like I don't know 2017 when I was a social media manager. Literally half my job was making the GIFs smaller. um so I think there was that like the kind of basic features of the site, and then just the fact that it was so secluded away from the rest of the internet, and because it emphasized sort of identity and customization of your own page, collecting and curating images and incorporating them into your own space made sense with the sort of like stockpiling tradition of fandom. And then Tumblr's tagging feature is also really special because it's one of the few tagging features that allows people to write, you can write spaces in between words. So people could write out entire sentences.
Which is such a weird, simple thing. And like, yeah, Twitter still doesn't have that ability. Yeah, if you want to do like add a sentence or something or a phrase to a tag, it has to all run together in
Yeah.
one, you know, word sort of thing.
Yeah, I think like the culture of tagging was just so different from what it ever was on Twitter or Instagram. Like fans would use it as sort of a secondary place to riff and make jokes, but also like Tumblr. I think a lot of people in fandom are really invested in archiving their fandom and making their blogs like very meticulous and searchable. So you'll see on Tumblr, like if you can go through people's archives, like sorted by tags, and a lot of them will be, have like 100 different tags with all of their posts throughout the years about One Direction, and they're like organized so that they're completely visible, which isn't something it would really make sense to do with your tweets. But I think yeah, the combination of the features and then sort of this feeling of seclusion and anonymous conversation where everybody was coming together only based on their shared interests really contributed to it.
Mm-hmm. So the subtitle is How Fangirls Created the Internet as We Know It. How do you define fangirl? Is a fangirl necessarily under 18? Does it have to be female? Can anyone be a fangirl?
Yeah, I mean, I think like at the beginning of the book, I'm talking about sort of the trope of the fangirl, which is like in the popular imagination, like a young, like teenage girl screaming hysterically.
Mm-hmm.
But throughout the book, I'm also talking about women who are older, or fans who are not women, or fans who are people of color who are not usually represented in this like image you have of what a One Direction fangirl is. It's usually really conflated with this like white suburban teenager. So I mean, obviously like the feelings of fandom, the like feeling of, I guess, organizing your life or your identity in some way around this like object of your affection is something that anybody can experience. But part of the goal of the book was to, I guess, illustrate how complex that is. And I started with the trope to illustrate that trope was insufficient, and then kind of went out from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you go into sort of like the history of being a fan in general, and modern fans in the modern sense, and like often fandom that is primarily associated with women is treated as less serious and not worthy of respect or study. And so like when the Beatles first came to America, the most visible fans were teenage girls screaming, and that caused like a lot of adult white male critics at the time to sort of be like, well, this is a joke, this is just garbage for kids. And then it turned out that like the Beatles are still the most successful, by some measures, I guess, popular music act of all time. And it's interesting to think about, like, there's multiple parallels between One Direction and the Beatles. They're, mainly British, I guess one is Irish. And five versus four, the musicians, obviously, they like were popular first in the UK and then came to America and became superstars. Does it end there? Are there other ways that comparing them makes sense, or does it make sense?
Yeah. Well, so I was watching I can't remember the names of anybody involved because they're all like British newscasters. I was watching a panel from some British news program that was from around the time that One Direction was at their peak, where they were talking about comparing them to the Beatles. And one of the men on the panel was saying like, well, they're just as famous as the Beatles, but I think the difference is that like the Beatles had a cultural impact and One Direction's not having a cultural impact, which I thought was just like a utterly ridiculous statement. And also that is kind of what people thought about the Beatles at the time too, was that, if they were having any kind of cultural impact, it was like basically like voodoo. Like it was a lot of it was kind of like racially tinged. It was part of the like fear of rock and roll in general.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this assumption that like if something was super popular amongst young women, then it must like, kind of inherently be pointless.
Right.
And like I get sort of like torn talking about these things because like I'm also a person who like appreciates art and thinks it's worthy of seriousness, and don't want to start arguing that One Direction's like an amazing, historically significant musical act that created musical masterpieces, because I don't think that's the case. But I just think people in both situations like lost out on an opportunity to observe some really interesting cultural phenomena because they just weren't invested in asking any questions. Like that was really notable to me in a lot of the early coverage of Beatlemania is that like all of these reports, which are very colorful and a lot of them written in quite an engaging way, very few of them bothered to stop and ask a single one of these women like what they were thinking or like why they were doing what they were doing, which just seems like such an utter failure of journalism and like a really sad like deficit of curiosity, because basically anybody that you ask about why they're doing something like screaming in a public place is going to have like a pretty interesting and specific answer just because like most people have interesting and specific lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you take a group seriously that has often been not taken seriously, and more people are paying attention to fans in general now. But yeah, just like it's sort of like things that men were fans of, predominantly like Star Trek and Star Wars or something, sort of got taken seriously by mainstream or like upper middle brow culture like earlier than things that young women were fans of. Even though sort of they're not necessarily like one is not necessarily deeper or more complex than the other.
Yeah, well, I think there is still, I think the like nerd stigma was persistent for a pretty long time, or still kind of is. I mean, I guess Star Wars and those properties like were judged in different ways than fangirls. But I think all kinds of fandom can be subject to that sort of like stigma of like you've crossed over a line of caring too much about this and like
Mhm.
you live in a fantasy. Maybe the one that escapes judgment the most often is like sports fandom, which is
Right.
you know
Yeah, that we're supposed to take sports extremely seriously, and but why is that any more or less important in its essence than pop music or you know Buffy the Vampire Slayer or something
Mhm.
else? Um, so one other thing I was thinking about. Okay, so like I said, I knew almost nothing about One Direction before I read this, and then got more interested in them as I read. And I was asking a friend like, what is their most famous song? Because I don't really know any of their songs, and I can't remember which one she said, but it's maybe it was like their first big hit. It's like them playing on the beach in the music video.
Yeah. Yeah. What makes you beautiful?
Yes. And I listened to it, and I watched the video and listened to it, and I was like, this sounds vaguely familiar, but I if someone just played this for me, I'm not sure. Like, I probably wouldn't have been able to place it. And
Yeah.
like I said, I'm the opposite of the audience for this type of music. But if you go back to the comparison of the Beatles and then like how omnipresent their music became versus the One Direction music, like it does seem like it was more of a subculture hothouse, or at least in terms of the music and how the music spread versus some other creative acts from the past that we could compare them to, like Backstreet Boys or NSYNC or something, or New Kids on the Block, or the British invasion bands. Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
Yeah. I think maybe partly because they would have been in the beginning of the streaming era. Like a lot of fans that I interviewed for the book talked about becoming One Direction fans because they ended up like in a YouTube recommendation rabbit hole.
Hmm.
So I think maybe that has to do with like kind of the end of the monoculture or whatever. Like we
Right.
have so many huge pop stars now, and that's like part of why who do you stand is like a signifier of identity is because there's always many choices of who to stand at this time.
Right. And for people who don't know what stan means, could you give a definition of that term?
Oh yeah, I feel like this is a word that I learned from context on Twitter, and then only later was like, oh, I didn't realize that there was some debate over the origins of this term. But I thought originally, and I think some people still use it this way, that it was a portmanteau of stalker and fan.
Hmm.
But I think other like more commonly embraced definition is that it's a reference to like the Eminem song about an obsessive fan named Stan.
Hmm.
Personally, I don't like totally think that makes sense because I don't feel like the people who started using it first would have been listening to Eminem, but whatever.
Right. And that
That's for the historians to decide.
and that song came out when I was in high school, like 1999 or so,
Mhm.
and probably didn't enter popular usage in its modern form until at least a decade later or more. So yeah, the etymology may be lost at the sands of times, but it's stan. It can be both a noun describing the person who's a super fan or a verb, I think. So like
Yeah.
I stan Harry, or I stan Zane. Okay, so well, stepping back a little bit, how did you decide that, like how did the book come together in your mind or as you were writing it, such that you combined talking about this one specific band, but as like a lens to look at all sorts of ways that internet culture has changed over the past 10 years or so?
Well, originally I knew I wanted to do a book about fandom and the internet, but originally I thought I would do sort of like a collection of essays that was about different fandoms. And my agent kind of, I would say steered, but more like shoved me away from that idea and was sort of like, no, I think this makes more sense to do like, you know, through whatever you have personal experience of, which I
Hmm.
think was ultimately totally the right call because like internet fandom is such a broad category. There's just like it would have been impossible to pick like a representative collection of fandoms to talk about because there's just like I mean, even in writing this book, I was like, there's so many different pop music fandoms that I think are important that I need to read about so that I can like understand this fandom. And if I had tried to introduce also like, I don't know, anime, sports, web comics, Marvel, whatever, like I would have just like gone on forever and I would have not gotten anywhere. So, and I think also like some of the stuff about the personal meaning of fandom like sounds a little bit abstract and also a little bit like I don't know, mystical and like woo woo if it's
Hmm.
not like presented within the context of like a granular like life story. So that was part of the reason too.
Right. So when did you decide to include some memoiristic aspects to it? Was that part of the plan from the beginning?
Yeah, it was definitely part of the plan from the beginning. I think it was weird to me how hard that stuff was to write because I'm like somebody who's written about myself on the internet for a long time. Just like in passing in stuff I was writing for work. And then I also have like a newsletter with my friend Lizzie, which is basically just like diaristic about our lives. And it was just but it was like it was so much weirder to be sort of it felt a little bit self-aggrandizing to like insert personal narrative into this like sort of sweeping cultural analysis that I wanted to do. And I found it so much harder to think about like saying something embarrassing about my life in book form, even though I do know intellectually that like far fewer people are going to buy and read this book than would possibly come across something on the internet. Um, I don't know. It was like it started off like a pretty minor part of the book, and then I realized during the editing process that it read as pretty dishonest and like
Hmm.
needed to be more specific. So that's why I added some of the more um like I don't know, undignified information.
Well, I think it works, and there's parts of the book that are moving where you're talking about your own life, and so it's a interesting combination, and sort of new journalism esque or something, or just taking from the confessional nature of online writing. But I think it works really well. So it's funny that you were saying like you couldn't narrow down, if you were to pick 10 fandoms or something, there would be hundreds left. Like, well, how do you think, how would you evaluate the claim that like all of modern life is now fandom? and the fandom tendencies have infected everything, and the meeting of social media and fan tendencies is like hypercharged and maybe made worse a lot of modern life. Like what is MAGA aside from like Trump like stands?
Yeah.
And they're so, and people are so personally identified with Trump the person, and just the sort of like tribalism that everything in contemporary America is one side versus the other, and it seems like an online flame war of One Direction fans fighting with Justin Bieber fans or something.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think like the internet and fandom are sort of like maybe like a little bit of a chicken and eggs type situation, because I think a lot of the way that I understand like modern life seems driven by the architecture of social platforms. Like I think, we've really been steered to think constantly about what signifiers and like symbols and products and types of language we want to collect and assimilate into our identity. And you see people bickering over this on Twitter all day long about like, what thing did you say about the best pizza in Chicago that was so wrong and I need to correct it, like I think that's a symptom of social media, but it is fandom is really well suited to that kind of debate and that kind of projection of self that like relies on, you know, using things from the media or from popular culture and sort of cobbling together an identity. And then yeah, I think because fandom has been such a dominant presence on social media platforms, the kind of emotional balance of fandom speak, the attention getting strategies of fans, the like responses to criticism that fans typically make, those are things that have infected a lot of other kinds of discourse. And as you mentioned, especially in political discourse, I think it's like particularly apparent, the way that, people will turn an Elizabeth Warren quote into like a t-shirt and a tote bag and a set of earrings and a champagne flute to sell on Etsy, or the way that you can see like Republican senators like Josh Hawley or Ted Cruz like are very aware of their social media followings, and you can see them when they're speaking in congressional hearings like really trying to get that soundbite of owning the libs that's going to go viral on Twitter, or whatever on the weird right-wing alternative Twitters.
Mhm.
Like I think like once you start looking for it, you start to see it everywhere. There's just this like constant toggling between like adoration and vitriol. And then there's also just like constantly sorting and like refining the groups more and more, like who belongs where based on what they like. And like, it just feels like we're constantly creating these like never-ending documentations, of self, like through the things that we've collected as, whatever the objects of our fandom, be that a pop star or a brand or a fashion aesthetic or whatever.
Right. And I'm thinking of, you know, it doesn't start here in politics, but like the 2016 primary between Bernie and Hillary, and how that like divided people into,
Yeah, totally.
two groups, and those identifications, like calling people Bernie bro, like that persisted after the election. And now like there's a faction of online supporters of Kamala Harris who
Yeah,
are called
they are
the K
wild.
Hive, which is derived from, well, is it? I've got messes up with the best. Is it the Beehive or the Bayhive? That's Beyonce's
I think
fandom.
it's Bayhive. I
Uh,
think.
I don't know. Well,
Yeah.
okay, either one. It
Now
seems like
now I have a seed of doubt, but I'm pretty sure it's Bayhive.
okay. They see. I mean, every fandom has like people who take it really to the extreme, but like the Kamala stands, like multiple like mainstream reporters have said that they're like the most vicious, people they've ever encountered online. If someone
Yeah.
writes a negative article about Harris, like they're getting like death threats in their DMs. And it does, yeah, I mean, it seems like it's the people who are obsessed with the pop star, but it's just it's a political analog, but it's not like these people are like super into, her like health reform plan or something. It's like it's like
Right.
some embodiment of her. Yeah, so it seems in politics it seems like very bad. And like it didn't start in 2016. Like Obama had a sort of like cult of personality around him as well and was a very charismatic figure. But yeah, once I don't know, yeah, just as you said, online, the way online works encourages people to identify their persona with things they like. And so they make their avatar, if they're really into Bernie, they make their avatar on Twitter a Bernie icon. And then that's sort of like who they are. And people can see that and they're either like, yes, that's the team I'm on, or that's the team I hate.
Right. Yeah. Now that you're saying this, like the Kamala hive, I feel like somebody needs to write like 8,000 words about it. I don't really get it. I don't get why she would have such a vicious, seemingly youthful fan base, but like
I'm not sure they're youthful, honestly, but they do seem vicious. It seems strange to me also. Um, and yeah, I don't know. It's weird stuff.
she's like not a charismatic figure. I'm saying this and now I'm gonna get death threats, but
Yeah,
like
you
it
better
doesn't
be
make
careful
sense.
what you say about her. Okay. So one part so getting back to the book, one part that I found really fascinating was Larry Stylison. Is that how you would say it? Stylison?
Yeah, Stylinson, yeah.
Okay. Could you explain what this means and why it's sort of like
Yeah,
tore the One Direction fandom in half?
I know it's very dramatic. There's two chapters. But so Larry Stylinson started out as the ship name, so like imaginary romantic pairing between Harry Styles and Louis Tomlinson, two members of the band. People
So
used
so
to
just so shipping like comes from the fan fiction world, and
yeah,
like in the 60s people wrote fanfics about how like Kirk and Spock were in a romantic relationship, and it like evolved from there. And like seemingly every fandom that's around a fictional property has like people writing fan fiction in which like two men who are presented as straight in the work are like actually in love with each other. And that became like its own genre. And it doesn't always have to be two men, but it's like, you know working out a imaginary relationship between two characters. And then this, what you mentioned previously with like the fan fiction sites banning the real person fanfic, like, so yeah, this plays into it, and like sort of fiction and reality start getting intertwined in bizarre ways.
yeah, yeah. So it started out as just fan fiction, or at the beginning of the band, like people did hypothesize like, oh look, they're flirting with each other, because they were kind of, I mean, if you look at the gifs, like they're just like young boys like goofing around, and it does have sort of like a sweet I don't know, connotation to it. And people were having fun with the speculation, which like I want to emphasize is like totally harmless, and like was a really exciting and fun and creative opportunity for people for a long time. But then it sort of soured because it took on this like conspiratorial tone of like the management of One Direction is forcing them to be closeted. Therefore, like any woman that we see in their orbit is like in on the scheme, manipulative, gold digger, liar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, using them for their money to get plastic surgery and all of this stuff. There was just like a ton of misogyny, and then just like vicious infighting within the fandom over it, because anybody who questioned the rationality of the Larry Stylinson diehards would be called homophobic. There was just a lot of, I think, like wielding of like social justice trump cards kind of back and forth because of the spirit of Tumblr at the time. and then eventually, like, I think like the breaking point where it really becomes like a schism in the fandom that like couldn't be overcome was when a bunch of people who believed in Larry decided that Louis Tomlinson's baby was not real, was like a doll, or or later a hired actor, or various explanations emerged over time. But that whole affair was called Babygate, and they went about trying to prove that the baby was fake. There's still people to this day that believe that there was actually some chatter on Tumblr recently about how Babygate would come to an end and the true paternity of Freddie Tomlinson would be the day that my book was released, so that it would make everything in my book inaccurate.
Oh wow. Okay, so you yourself have gotten dragged into this conspiracy world.
Yeah,
That's
totally.
wild.
Yeah, so because I think something that surprised me when I was researching those chapters was how much like those conspiracy theories were really the product of only like a pretty small handful of people within the fandom, most of whom were adults the whole time. And they really sort of like influenced, and I don't think it's unfair to say manipulated, a lot of younger fans into participating in these things. And they really, I don't know, I mean, they participated in what we would call media manipulation, like editing things to appear a certain way, disseminating half facts, like claiming authority on things they didn't really have authority on. And in this secluded space of Tumblr, which is both a positive and also a way where things, like a location for things to fester. So yeah, so I think like it was it like I don't think it's representative of fandom. It's certainly not representative of what like shipping or fic culture always is, but it's something that's happened in other fandoms too. And I think it's because usually there are these like small groups of fans in the fandom who like see an opportunity to like be the special fans who have noticed something that no one else has noticed, and they can kind of like create a little fiefdom around that.
Right. So yeah, I found this part of the book really fascinating, and the parallels between this and other conspiracy theorizing that has sort of taken over the country over the past couple of years are, pretty obvious. And I remember like after like right after the January 6th riot or whatever you want to call it, I tweeted something like, I sort of understand the appeal of QAnon because I got really into Lost and would like read Lost theories and message boards online. And like there's just sort of something about, I mean, there's a natural human instinct towards like mysteries and solving mysteries and decoding things and seeing significance in signs and symbols, but like the like hothouse atmosphere of an online community really hypercharges that. And
Mm-hmm.
you just see it everywhere, of people thinking, so some of the Larry stuff would be like the management doesn't want their love to be open, so they have to keep it a secret, but they're sending signals through various numbers that they might say or include in a song, or like the time they post something online. And so it gets into this sort of like numerology. There's some term related to like the Hebrew Bible, like gematria or something, of like interpreting numbers in a way to find their hidden significance. So like there's something about online life that encourages this and turns people who maybe would not have gotten into this sort of thing into like decoders of reality, looking for secret signs and symbols. And like that's QAnon. It was all about Trump said a specific word. He said like the word storm, like, and that had like this occult meaning within QAnon, and that proved to the QAnon believers that like, oh, like he's guiding this whole thing. And it's just like insane. It's like this, so the Larry part is sort of like farcical, and then all the people who got convinced by QAnon and then stormed the Capitol, like this is like tragic and but still farcical and absurd. I don't know. It's it seems really messed up. And I don't know if there's a way out of it, because it just seems to be something, the way social media works
Yeah.
encourages this.
Well, I guess I think like what's disturbing and what's similar about them is that it's possible on the internet to live in your own like chosen just like information environment, where with like whichever reality you've chosen is the true one and the one that everyone around you is focused on. But at the same time, like people do come out of QAnon, and people also came out of Larry. I mean, I don't love to compare the two really, but um like within fandom, there are fans who are super aware of these patterns and very critical of them and have written super interesting pieces of writing on Tumblr, kind of dissecting why these things happen over and over. And I think like people do like if you do have to like want to stay immersed in these conspiracy theories in order to stay immersed. Like like I mentioned, the kind of influencers within the Larry Stylinson fandom who sort of deliberately controlled the information that was getting onto people's Tumblr feeds. But like that has its limits, obviously, right? Like you do look at things other than the Tumblr feed. And the same thing with QAnon people. Like I think like it it's not as it's not as if they were literally born yesterday, you know, like they they
No,
do understand on
yeah,
some level like how things work.
but
Uh
like, okay, they weren't. It wasn't like a sorcerer, put a magic spell on them
yeah,
and they lost their reason. But like,
right,
people believed this so much that they drove to Washington and stormed the Capitol. So and of
right.
everyone who like was sort of vaguely believed QAnon, maybe only 1% believed it enough to commit a like
Yeah.
failed coup. But it's a big country, and you get a couple thousand people, and you could do something really bad. And so yeah, and like a lot of those people, like they were true believers, and
Right.
yeah, and just I don't know, it's like when you're in just a small group and anywhere, it can like become extreme if there's like one extreme person or a couple extreme people who want to like push in one direction.
Yeah.
No pun intended. And like online, yeah, the person who, you'll like never win a fight against like someone in a comment section who is like 100% committed, because like they will devote their life to proving you wrong. Like they don't have anything else. They are, they will like abandon their family to argue with you. And if you're any sort of normal person, you'll just be like, okay, I need to go like eat dinner or see my loved ones now. And, so you give up, and then they get a feather in their cap for having like defeated you in an argument.
Yeah. I guess like so with the QAnon, I feel like people who genuinely literally believe QAnon are like probably mentally unwell. I'm like not a psychologist. But for the rest of them, I guess like I feel like after reporting on them for so long, I'm sort of over like the mystique of those guys. And I feel like it's just the very transparent cover that they are using because they are like white supremacists who like don't believe in a multiracial democracy. So like when you're storming the Capitol, like maybe it feels better to say it's because of QAnon than because you're like a like frothing rabid racist.
But okay, that makes sense. But at the same time, like most people think that whatever they're doing is sort of like the good thing,
Yeah.
like both for them and in some larger sense good. Like
Yeah.
like there aren't a lot of people who are like, I'm gonna go do something bad, and like I know it's bad. Um, like the mind is able to justify your actions or beliefs after the fact. And so I think the people who stormed the Capitol mostly were like, yeah, this is great. We're going to do something great and we're going to save the country. Like, I think
Yeah.
people generally believe that. And they believed it because they fell into this weird online subculture.
Yeah. But they're going to save it from people who aren't white, is what they're going to save it from.
Right. I mean, I'm sure plenty of them are racist, but they probably were not. It wasn't like, I don't think it was like, okay, I'm going to the Klan rally now. It was like, I'm going to save the country.
I
And
don't
so
think it
there's
is
probably
directly, but
there
like
was a lot of them had like a racist belief underlying that, but like there were non-white people there as well. Like this
sure.
plenty of Americans fell into this insanity. And it wasn't all just like, yeah, like a bunch of racists. It was seemingly some of these people had, like, were apolitical people who like encountered this stuff, and somehow it appealed to them. And people who are like disaffected from the system in general are more likely to believe in some sort of conspiratorial hand like guiding things.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know. So I reading the book, I sort of felt like there was a sort of narrative progression where in the earlier part of the book, you're sort of like celebrating all the really like funny, inventive, clever things that One Direction fans are doing. And that reminds me of like, the circa 2010 internet where it's like, oh, this is so great. Like we're coming together, we're creating things. And then there's like a sort of movement towards a darker time as like American life and online life in tandem have become darker as well.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
would you agree with that?
No, definitely. I mean, I started working on the internet at the like sort of I don't know, middle of Gamergate. And
Hmm.
then like my first I was a social media manager when I started working, and then like when I became a reporter was leading up to the 2016 election when that was when Hillary Clinton was like explaining what Pepe the Frog is or whatever. And people were so curious about like the alt-right
Hmm.
and incels and like all of these like dark internet subcultures that led to, like mass shooting manifestos and things like that. And it was like the first time I feel like people were really, or like mainstream journalists were really trying to like reckon with the offline effects of internet culture. And some of that did become a little bit like histrionic or hysterical at times, I think. But it was also like a really necessary recalibration. And then yeah, like some of the darker elements of fandom like really map to onto those same trends pretty well. Like fandom is also very good at harassment and like I said, like very good at conspiracy thinking and media manipulation and like all these things that we associate with like those darker tides of the
Right. I mean,
internet.
yeah, I mean, like Gamergate was like not a fandom exactly, but sort of like fan dynamics, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah, definitely.
like
I
directed it
mean,
in
yeah.
like extremely negative ways. Okay, we've gone a little bit long, and there's stuff we haven't discussed, but I really, recommend this book to anyone who spends any time online, which is probably a lot of people listening to this. And yeah, you don't need to be a fan of One Direction to enjoy this book. Have you gotten any feedback from One Direction fans? Are people? So some people think that your book is part of the anti-Larry conspiracy, but maybe
Yeah.
people who are more tethered to reality within the fandom have you talked to any
Um
of them who've read the book?
Yeah, I have seen like some nice stuff on Tumblr and I've gotten some nice emails. I haven't heard that much from the Larry contingency really. There was like a little bit of Twitter murmuring, but I'm a huge advocate of having no Twitter notifications. So so a lot of times I don't even see that stuff.
Hmm. Okay, that's wise. Yeah. Um, anything else you want to say about the book or the general topic before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I think this is a really fun conversation. Yeah, I hope your listeners are end up being Team Nile over Team Harry if they do decide to dip their toes in.
Yeah, we did. I mean, we barely even talked about the individual guys. I mean, Styles himself is having like a huge moment right now.
Oh yeah, I
And
know.
so he's like the Justin Timberlake, more or less, of the group who's had the most successful like solo career.
It's so terrible that being the successful one is named after Justin Timberlake, one of the most irritating personalities in all of popular culture.
That's true. Yeah, he seems like a bad person, and he's been like the malefactor in more than one, at least two very prominent like cultural I don't know what the word is exactly,
Like witch
controversies or
hunts.
something. Yeah, like the Janet Jackson and how badly he treated Britney Spears. But yeah, like I said, I really enjoyed the book and would recommend it to people who have listened to this conversation and got something from it. So a link to the Amazon page will be, in the podcast notes. And the title again is Everything I Need I Get From You, which is a line from a One Direction song, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's from their last album.
So check it out. And if people want to follow more of your work in general, where would you direct them?
You can locate my byline on The Atlantic, or I'm on Twitter at KAIT_Tiffany.
But you will not, that's, people cannot get your attention on Twitter because you silence your notifications.
Correct.
So, but you can follow your social media presence there, and I'm on Twitter at ARYHEW. So thank you again, Kaitlyn. This has been a great conversation, and congrats on the book. And thanks to our viewers and listeners, or I guess they're just listeners now. Thanks to our listeners. We'll see you again next time.
All right. Great. Thank you so much.